I know that by running a movie review YouTube channel, I've already outed myself as a total geek. Yes, I love movies. In fact, I still buy them in physical copies because the quality of disc is always a smidge better than on streaming. I'm also an avid comic book collector, which will clue you in on how my high school dating life probably went. But what if I told you there was more? What if I told you that there was another avenue that occupied my time? No, not video games, I suck at those and I hate them. No, one of my other favorite hobbies is Dungeons & Dragons. For those that are unaware, Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, is a role-playing game that allows for players to portray different types of characters in an imaginary world. This world is set up by the Dungeon Master, or the DM. I have been in several campaigns with different friend groups since college, and the one I'm currently in has been going strong since 2021. And while it may have been a fringe interest a few years ago, it's quickly grown in popularity, largely due, in my opinion, to the Netflix series Stranger Things. And whenever a property starts reaching new mainstream heights, you can bet your bottom dollar, or Bitcoin, that Hollywood will be all over it. This brings us to Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. Now, believe it or not, this isn't the first movie based on the role-playing game. There was an attempt made a few years back starring Jeremy Irons. I haven't seen the full thing myself, but I have seen some of it, and, well... So as a Dungeons & Dragons player myself, I couldn't help but be cautiously optimistic for a brand new, updated movie out of this. I was also cautiously optimistic because the film's writers and directors, Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, made the 2018 comedy Game Night. Game Night was a film that absolutely slaps and had no reason to be as great as it was. I even distinctly remember thinking as I was watching it, man, these directors are destined to do something great. And lo and behold, I was correct. Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves is an absolute blast. It captures all of the fun and creative energy that I experienced while playing the game, while also being accessible enough for general audiences to go in blind and still have a good time. This movie is structured as a heist story set in a fantasy world, which fits the mold of a typical Dungeons & Dragons campaign setup perfectly. This mismatched band of outcasts includes Chris Pine as a charming nobleman turned thieving bard, Michelle Rodriguez as a fierce barbarian, Justice Smith as an amateur sorcerer, Sophia Lillis as a shape-shifting druid, and a few others. Everyone plays their parts well, and the script gives most of them a decent amount of development as they go on this adventure. The only team member who didn't get as much development is Sophia Lillis as the druid. She gets sufficient motivation at the beginning for wanting to embark on this quest, and she does have one of the movie's coolest action sequences. I just wish we saw more of her. Chris Pine is great, as always. He's been stuck playing Captain Kirk since 2009, but it works here. And there's actually a lot more emotional depth given to him than I was expecting. The reason why I'm going into so much detail about the character work is because it's the most important thing to get right in a Dungeons & Dragons movie. You see, when setting up your campaign, players are able to create enriching backstories that can later come up in the main quest line. This movie does that in spades, and it let me know that the writers actually played the game before and wanted to treat it with respect. And I couldn't help but totally geek out whenever I would see some spell or item that was used. There are various points where I would go, wow, that's the insert magic item here of insert magic spell here. The movie would introduce said thing as a small comedic bit, but then it would later turn around and actually use them in later action sequences. It's classic setup and payoff. I know it's not necessarily groundbreaking stuff, but I miss it when this was commonplace in most action blockbusters. Speaking of action, this movie has lots of it, and I never found myself getting bored while watching it. The filmmakers found interesting ways to incorporate each of the characters' unique skills into the sequences, which constantly kept things interesting. This whole movie is just filmed with such energy, which you need because it clocks in at around 2.5 hours. It just absolutely astounds me that this thing came from the Game Night directors. From the first time I saw that incredible one-take sequence at the mansion, I knew these guys were going places. Seriously, keep an eye on them because some big franchise is going to scoop them up real soon. The film isn't perfect, however. I did have some minor quibbles along the way. There is a character that's introduced at a certain point, and in a brief few minutes became my favorite character of the whole thing. He's funny, skilled, and had a backstory that was closely tied with the main plot at hand. Then, for no apparent reason at all, he just sort of disappears. I was immediately reminded of Quicksilver from X-Men and Ana de Armas from No Time to Die. Hey movies, stop introducing awesome characters then promptly giving them the boot. There's also another character who's brought in by the main villain to hunt down the group of heroes. He's set up as this hardened warrior, unmatched at combat, then he just kind of vanishes as well. Overall, this movie doesn't have the most developed villains, but at the same time, it does such a great job at focusing in on the protagonist that it doesn't really matter. Every D&D campaign takes place from the perspective of the main heroes anyway, so the lack of a compelling villain didn't really bother me as much as it normally would. And as I said before, this thing clocks in at around 2.5 hours, and it did not need to be 2.5 hours. You could have very easily cut 15 minutes out of this thing and it still would have been as fun. If anything, it would be more efficient. But overall, I had a great time watching Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves. I was able to see it at an early screening, and the audience laughed and did their appropriate cheering at all the right moments. And in case you're wondering if you could still go into this movie without playing Dungeons & Dragons, I think you should be mostly fine. To you, it'll just feel like a well-written fantasy heist because that's what it is. Only it's one that's chock full of clever little references that'll probably fly over most people's heads, but all of you fellow D&D players will feel like a kid on Christmas morning. I saw this movie with a friend who has never played a single Dungeons & Dragons campaign in his entire life, and he got just as much enjoyment out of it as I did. So in the end, Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves does justice to the tabletop role-playing game that inspired it. It works well as a standalone story, while simultaneously getting me excited for all the other adventures that may follow with this world. I'm gonna give Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves a solid B+.